So, I think we can start this evening's talk. And of course, tonight is the Vesak evening. In case you don't know, it's actually today, which is the real Vesak evening, and not on Sunday when we're having the celebration here. And if you go outside, you will see that the moon is up. I saw the moon when I just came into the center about an hour ago. It's a big, big, bright moon up in the sky here. Very inspiring and very beautiful. And you find that when you read the word of the Buddha, you read the sutras, you find the Buddha always talked about the full moon night is like an inspiring night. When the monks practice extra, they come out in the evening and they practice in the night because the light is so beautiful, particularly if you go out into the forest, like Bodhinyana Monastery or Dhammasara, somewhere away from the city. You find it's a beautiful, nice light on the full moon evenings. It's like a magical quality to it. And I know some people go a bit funny, a bit crazy when that happens, but it's also a time for spiritual practice. It's a bit of both in a sense. It sort of draws out either the best in you, sometimes maybe bad things as well. But it's an inspiring day, and monks would meditate often throughout the night. There would be Dhamma talks on those days at the time of the Buddha, and they would chant their precepts, the Patimokkha, together to reaffirm their commitment to the Dhamma and to the practice at that time. So it's a very inspiring time. And of course, the Vesak night is extra inspiring because the Vesak night, not only is it a full moon night when you want to practice hard, but it's also a day which is celebrating the Buddha. We're celebrating the birth, the enlightenment, and the passing away of the Buddha. So it has a double quality to it. So it's really, that's why it is probably the most powerful day of the year, of the Buddhist year, of the Buddhist calendar here. So it's a nice, great night to try to feel some inspiration in the Dhamma, get some deeper understanding of what this Dhamma is about, and in particular, of course, to reflect on the life of the Buddha, because that's what the Vesak celebration really is. It is a contemplation of the Buddha. We're celebrating the Buddha's life, the Buddha as a teacher. So mainly that is what it's all about. So I want to talk tonight about the Buddha and give you maybe, hopefully, a little bit deeper understanding of who the Buddha was, why he is important even now after 2,500 years. You might think the only thing which matters is the Dhamma, but it's also good to actually reflect on the Buddha himself. What happens when you do that? When you think about the Buddha, when you get more understanding of who he was as a human being, it's as if you get closer to the Dhamma in many ways. It's like everything, when you come to understand something more profoundly, you come closer to it. It's like touches your heart more deeply when you have that understanding. And this is, of course, important to us. The closer we are to the Dhamma, the more understanding you have, the more a kind of spiritual power you have, because the greater is your ability to practice this path. And we need all the support we can get for practicing this path. It's not always easy. It's not easy even to do simple things like being virtuous and being kind all the time. So we need all the support that we can get. And the Buddha said in, again, the sutras, in his discourses, he said that the person who sees the Buddha also sees the Dhamma. In other words, the Dhamma is the teachings. The person who sees the Dhamma sees the Buddha. So in other words, the more understanding you have of who the Buddha is, the more understanding you also have of the teachings. These things go together. And the reason for that is because the Buddha is essentially the embodiment of the Dhamma. The way the Buddha acts in the world, the way he is, the way he behaves, you can actually see the Dhamma coming alive by just watching the Buddha, understanding him. He is nothing else apart from the embodiment of the Dhamma. His entire mind, his whole life is dedicated to the Dhamma. The way he thinks, the way he acts, the way he speaks comes about because of the Dhamma. So everything about the Buddha is about the Dhamma. At the same time, if you understand what the Dhamma is about, if you have like a deep insight into the Dhamma, you know what the Buddha is. You understand what the Buddha, because again, the Buddha is nothing but the Dhamma coming alive. So these things go together. So when you understand the Buddha, you come closer to the Dhamma, and also you understand what the Dhamma actually means, and you get a more profound understanding of this whole thing. And that's why it is so useful to reflect on the Buddha himself. And there is again in the sutras, in the discourses of the Buddha, you find that the Buddha specifically said that one of the meditation techniques, one of the contemplations that are very useful for somebody who is a Buddhist is precisely to reflect on the qualities of the Buddha. And there's a list in the Pali which talks about all these qualities, that he is sort of is fully enlightened, that he understands the world and all these kind of things. I'm not going to talk about that list, but the list is there because when you reflect on the Buddha and you get that inspiration, you find that your confused mind, your unclear mind gets clarified, and you find this peace inside of you. And that makes it possible to meditate, it makes it possible to act with more kindness and more compassion in the world when you have that peace inside of you. So it is actually a central part of the Buddhist practice as well, to reflect on the Buddha and his qualities. Now, one of the problems that I have found in my life reflecting on the Buddha is that there's all these barriers between us and the Buddha. It's actually not that easy to come to an understanding of who the Buddha was. And some of those barriers are probably very obvious, and some of them are not so obvious. But one of the barriers which I found, certainly at the beginning when I became interested in the Buddhist practice, I wasn't maybe even a Buddhist yet, was a sense that the Buddha is so far away. 2,500 years ago. It seems so long ago. It seemed like there's an enormous time gap between us and him. So how can we relate to somebody who lived 2,500 years ago? Sometimes when you read something that happened 100 years ago, like the First World War, or if you go maybe 200 years back to the time when Australia was founded, and in Europe you had like Napoleon, Napoleonic wars and all these kind of things, you look at people in those days, you wonder, even in those days, they look completely different from us. They seem to behave in strange ways, and it's very hard to imagine even living in those days. It's only 200 years ago, but here we're talking about 2,500 years ago. So it's strange. We wonder, how can we relate to something so far back? But of course, the reality is, when you start to look at human beings, you realize that, yes, there are external differences. There are cultural differences, there are differences of behavior, there are circumstantial differences, all these kind of things. But if you look at a human being, if you look at the human mind, and you look inside, you see that we haven't changed all that much over a long, long period of time, and much longer than those 2,500 years since the time of the Buddha. And it's really when you start to read the sutras again, the discourse, and you start to understand what people were like at the time of the Buddha, you see that essentially they were behaving just like us, just as crazy as the world is today almost. It's almost like reading the West Australian in a newspaper or something when you read those sutras, some of those crazy things that went on. But first of all, you start to see that people had defilements. They were trying to amass riches in those days. They wanted large houses. They wanted a big chariot rather than a big car. They wanted nice clothes. They wanted all these things, just like people today are preoccupied with material wealth. It was exactly the same thing 2,500 years ago. Just like people today are occupied with being praised and not blamed for things, it was the same thing at the time of the Buddha. People wanted praise. They didn't want to be blamed. Just like people then were preoccupied about having a good name and about being famous rather than being notorious or whatever, exactly the same again as today. And you go deeper down, you see that the human psyche in those days was a psyche of greed, of anger, and of delusion, just like we have those same root defilements in this day. It was exactly the same thing. And also the potential for goodness was there in those days, just like it is now. Some people were kind, some people were compassionate, some people were peaceful, some people had a propensity for these good qualities in their lives. And one of the most interesting things which I find is actually to read and the Vinaya, the discipline, the code of discipline for the Buddhist monks. When you read that Vinaya, you see some of the most amazing stories that you might, which I said before, it's almost like reading a newspaper today, some of those stories. And these Vinaya rules, they always have an origin story, which explains how the Vinaya rule came about. And the Vinaya rule is like a rule of discipline for the monks. And the origin story tells you of the kind of misconduct that some of these monks were up to at the time of the Buddha. And you'd be surprised. There were like killings going on. Monks were killing each other. They were like stealing. There was one story where they were stealing from the king's timber yard because he wanted to build himself a kuti. So he just went into the king's timber yard and thought, oh, this is nice wood. I'll take some of this. But of course, it's not recommended to steal from the king's timber yard if he finds it out. That's what happened in this particular story here, etc., etc. And it's when you see that, you get away from this idea that some people have that at the time of the Buddha, everybody was special. They had really powerful spiritual powers. They were different from what we are today. It's not the case. At the time of the Buddha, people were exactly like people are today. There wasn't that much difference. They had defilements, we have defilements. They had kindness, we have kindness. And essentially, it is a continuum. Human beings are always going to be human beings. And the time span we have in between 2,500 years, 200 years, 25,000 years, 2 eons, is not going to make any difference. We are still basically the same. So by looking at it in this way, you can take away some of that gap in time between us and the Buddha. Now the other thing which I always felt was a little bit of a barrier between me and the Buddha was the fact that the Buddha was from India and I was from somewhere in Europe, or now in Australia, if you like. And I felt that, well, I went to India a few times and I thought, well, this is really different from what I'm used to. I can't really relate to this society all that well. And again, I felt a sense of distance between who the Buddha was and who I thought maybe I was. But again, you start looking at it more deeply, you realize that the cultural differences and the kind of social conditioning that we have, again, is a very shallow thing. It's not something which goes very deeply here. It's something which is just on the surface. And I know there was one very famous monk in Thailand known as Ajahn Tate, and he said once that, when you travel around the world, all you see, wherever you go, whoever you meet, whatever culture you go to, whatever you do, is more of the same. It's just more of the same. The food is a little bit different, it may taste different, but still it's the desire for food. The clothing may be slightly different, but the desire to have nice clothes is still there. The culture may be slightly different, but people have the same underlying problems, the same desires, the same angers, the same irritations. Wherever you go in the world, people are the same. It's not that amazing to go. I used to think that when I was young, I thought to think, I'd like to go to Asia because it sounds so exotic and different. But actually, you go to Asia, okay, it's nice, it's fine, there's no problem with Asia. But the underlying things are exactly the same as it was in my society. You come back to your own country, and sometimes I'm the kind of person who like to criticize my own country and think my own countrymen are a bunch of... because you are very close to your own countrymen, so it's very easy to criticize them. But when you look at it more carefully and with a more balanced point of view, again, you realize they are just human beings, just like anybody else. We're all the same. Culture is a very superficial thing. Underneath the superficial things, you find the same kind of human beings, the same desires, the same drives, the same thing which push us around the samsara, potentially forevermore. So again, you start looking at it that way, the distance between other people, the distance between India and Australia or whatever else starts to disappear. So these are some of the fairly superficial differences. But of course, there are other differences which are much more profound. And of course, one of those things is the fact that the Buddha was supposed to be enlightened. And most of us, we are not enlightened. Now that enlightened sounds like something very, very different from what we are. It sounds, you wonder, how can you possibly relate to somebody who is enlightened? Now, to relate to this, to be able to understand what enlightenment is all about, I think one of the first things which I like to do, I don't like to translate the word Buddha as enlightened. I like the word awakened. That's one of my preferred translations of the word Buddha. And actually, if you understand, if you know the word in the Pali language, it actually means awakened. The literal meaning is actually awakened. And for me, awakened has a sense of somebody who has woken up from the slumber of the world, from not seeing things clearly, from being a bit confused to becoming into clarity. That is what awakening is to me. Whereas enlightenment to me is a much more diffuse, a much more difficult word to really get to grasp grasp with. It is something which has to do with the kind of the Enlightenment in the 15th century in Europe and these kind of things. And sometimes it is used of all kinds of people. We say this one is enlightened, this one is not. It is not very, for me, it is very unclear. But awaken has something very, it works for me. It sort of makes sense. And maybe you will have to find the same thing here. So think about awakened. What does it mean again to be awakened? And one of the ways of looking at the Buddha, one of the ways in which he is different from us is precisely that he has this clarity of mind. He has clarity of mind and he has a sense of sanity. When you dream, it's like you are sort of halfway in a different world, you're not really here. But when you're awake, you have a stronger sense of sanity often. And the Buddha is like the extreme sanity that you can possibly have. It's a sanity where all delusion, all kind of misperceptions of the world have been taken away. It's sanity as far as you can go. And it's clarity as far as clarity can go. So to understand what the Buddha is then, imagine yourself, think of yourself at a time when you are most peaceful, when your mind is very clear, when you feel a sense of presence, when you feel that you understand what's going on, and you're not confused, don't have full of desires, you're not angry at any of these things. Now what does that feel like? It feels good, right? You feel sane, you feel clear, you feel you understand what's going on. And that is what the Buddha is, just much more so. So that is one way of understanding the Buddha, with this beautiful clarity of mind that we all touch occasionally. We move in that direction sometimes. And that is how you can understand the Buddha. Clarity and sanity. Now if you look at it in that way, somebody who is awakened, clear and sane, it starts to make sense what enlightenment actually is all about. Of course, it is much more than that. It's also about the ending of suffering, the ending of defilements. It's about happiness and compassion, all these kind of things. But sometimes it's good to just explain it in very simple terms, so it doesn't feel so far away from us. We can actually relate to what the Buddha was all about. So that is just a small suggestion for you. Try that and see if that kind of reflection works. And if it does, I think you can maybe gain some more sense of connection to the Buddha. And there's another thing as well, which I think is something which makes it hard sometimes to relate to the Buddha. And that is the fact that certainly when I started off reading about Buddhism and reading about the Buddha, it always occurred to me that the way the Buddha was explained by many kind of manuals and commentaries on the Buddha, he always was explained as this kind of almost like godlike creature with all kind of supernormal powers and somebody who existed for maybe time immemorial, and he was like kind of sometimes even described as a kind of energy behind everything else in the universe, and something which is always there but sometimes get reincarnated just for the benefit of humanity or whatever. And all these things I found it very, very hard to relate to. How could I, as a human being, relate to something that was completely out of this world, quite literally, something completely different, a god, something which had nothing to do with me? I couldn't relate to that. I couldn't. How could he understand me if I'm a human being? But he is something completely different. How can I, when I read his life, gain any inspiration from that life if he is like a god or he is something completely different? It didn't make any sense to me. I couldn't actually relate to that thing. And of course, it was only when I started reading what the Buddha actually said about himself and the kind of stories that you find in the sutras about the Buddha, that I started to realize that all of these other stories, they tend to be exaggerations. They're like legends and myth which grew up after the Buddha passed away. Because this is what happens in the world. When somebody who is important to you, when they pass away, like the Buddha or somebody else who's a spiritual teacher, it's one of these things in the human mind. We want to build them up. We feel a loss inside of us. And because we have a loss that our teacher has disappeared, we want to build them up and make them into something which maybe they are not. And then the legends and the myths and the exaggerations start to happen. And this also happens in Buddhism. So the only way you can get a reasonable picture of who the Buddha was is to actually read what the Buddha said about himself. And then you start to understand what he was. And the picture you get when you start reading what the Buddha said about himself is a very human picture. He is essentially a human being, just like the rest of us. Yes, he was wise. Yes, he was obviously an exceptionally good meditator. He had qualities but he was essentially a human being. Even though his qualities were stronger maybe in certain respects than ours, he was a human being. You read the sutras, the Buddha says about himself before he went out in his quest for enlightenment. He said, I am seeking the undefiled because I have defilements in myself. Defilements the Buddha had, when he talks about that, it means he had desires. He had presumably anger and irritation, just like we have, maybe not as much, but he had some there. And of course he had delusion. He didn't understand the world the way it actually is. So the Buddha had defilements. Now surely we can relate to that. We know what defilements are all about. And again, there the humanity of the Buddha comes out when you see these things. Then when the Buddha was getting old later on in his life, this is after he is enlightened, you read in the sutras that Buddha has to stretch out because he has back pains, he has stomach troubles, he has severe stomach pains towards the end of his life. He's getting old, his body is falling apart, his skin is getting wrinkled, just like it does for anybody who ages. And of course, finally, he dies. Now, what does that sound like? It sounds like a human being. It sounds like a human body. It sounds exactly like what's going to happen to all of us eventually as we get older and die. Again, you see the humanity of the Buddha. He was a human being, just like us, just like we are. And because of that, we can relate to him in a very direct way as a human being. And that's important because to me what that means is that when I read the sutras, when I see the life story of the Buddha, I see something which can inspire me, something which I can emulate, something which I can practice after her. Because his practice is, I know that I also can do the same, because finally, ultimately, we are both human beings. He was wiser. He may have done it faster. He may have had greater spiritual powers, but essentially, we are the same. So those are just some reflections there for you, just to make the Buddha more familiar as a person. So reflect on those things and see if you can get a more feeling for who this person was, who lived 2,500 years ago. And I can promise you, if you do that, it will have great benefits in your meditation practice and also in your understanding of what Buddhism is actually all about. So that is some of the ways of getting to know the Buddha. I also want to talk a little bit about those special qualities of the Buddha. What was it that actually made him different from us? What does it actually mean that he was enlightened? What are the qualities that are really important to understand in the Buddha as an enlightened person? And there's two things in particular that I want to focus on, and that is the Buddha's wisdom and the Buddha's compassion. And to understand what the Buddha's wisdom is all about, first of all, we have to understand what the word wisdom actually means. Now, one way of approaching this is to make it very simple. Now, think about who are the people in your life that you have considered wise? Who are the people that you went to when you had a difficult time, needed to resolve something? Somebody always had good advice to you. And I think we all, maybe most of us anyway, have had somebody in our life that we felt we could go to, like an uncle, a grandparent, a friend, even a parent, a teacher perhaps, or a spiritual guide, whoever it was, somebody there that every time we went to them, they had something to say that helped us resolve the problem, helped us feel more peaceful, helped us feel more relaxed. Why is it that we consider that person wise? Think about that for a second. Why is this person wise? Well, the reason why they are wise is because they can resolve the problems in our life. They can help us move away from whatever suffering we're experiencing and move us towards happiness. So that is what wisdom is. Wisdom is this ability to understand happiness and suffering in the world, to understand how we can move towards greater sense of peace, greater sense of ease, greater sense of happiness, and how we can remove the suffering in our life. And whenever we think of a wise person, I say that's what we're thinking of as wisdom. somebody who can help us in that sense. And of course, the point is that the Buddha, if there's anybody who is out there who is wise, anybody who can help us move away from suffering towards happiness, of course the Buddha is the supreme example of that. His whole teaching revolves around understanding suffering and happiness and moving away from the suffering and moving towards happiness. So the Buddha had the supreme wisdom because he understood suffering and happiness to its absolute limit. So this is how we should understand the idea of wisdom in our lives and why the Buddha is so special. And sometimes you find that when you read what the Buddha said, sometimes you think, well, I can't make any sense of this, even though you think that the Buddha may have been very wise and very sharp, and you may agree with many of the things he said. Sometimes it's just simply too profound, and you wonder, wow, boy, this is so hard to understand. I can't really accept this. I feel like rejecting it. But of course, if you do think that the Buddha was a wise person, and I certainly think he was extraordinarily wise, then the right attitude, if you come across something you find strange or unusual, just put it to one side for a while. Don't make any final decision whether it's right or wrong. Put it to one side and come back to it in a few months or maybe a few years' time and then see what it looks like at that time instead. Because we develop, we evolve, we change. And something which didn't make sense yesterday can make sense today. And this, of course, has to do with the profundity of the wisdom. We're talking about very deep wisdom here. If you're going to be able to solve all the suffering in a person's life, it's going to have to be something very profound and very different from what we are used to. And of course, that is why the teachings of the Buddha often are difficult to understand and difficult to relate to. So that is the wisdom aspect of the Buddha, the fact that he understood everything there is to understand about happiness and suffering. The other aspect is the compassion aspect of the Buddha. And to understand this, you can think about the Buddha after he attained his awakening experience. He had understood everything about happiness and suffering in the world. He knew everything that human beings and animals and anybody else is seeking for in their lives. And then he looks out into the world and he sees all the suffering out there. He sees people seeking desperately to be happy, but not really understanding where happiness is to be found. He understands what everybody else doesn't understand, and he knows that he has the ability to help. What happens then? Compassion arises. When you know that you can help somebody, and you know that they might even be able to listen to what you have to say, then compassion arises. And this, of course, is what happened to the Buddha. He saw the suffering of beings. He knew he had the solution. So compassion arose, and he decided that he was going to teach in the world, to teach this beautiful teaching that he had discovered. And it's important here to understand who the Buddha actually was after he was enlightened. Remember that one of the things that you understand when you become enlightened is you see the non-self nature of reality. It's one of the essential teachings of Buddhism, that there is no ultimate final self inside of us. Things are always impermanent, changing. There is no core inside a human being. Because of that, because the Buddha had discovered this fully, because he had full insight into non-self, he didn't really have an ego anymore in the sense that ordinary beings have ego. He didn't have anything to prove. He didn't have any reason to go out into the world to become famous, or to do things to get praise, or to do things to get all kind of honor and gain and all these kind of things. All that becomes irrelevant when you understand the teaching of non-self at its deepest level. So the Buddha was beyond all that. None of these things could move him. None of these things were part of his motivation when he went out into the world. The Buddha had only one motivation. There was only one single reason why he taught anything at all. And that single reason is compassion. Nothing else motivated the Buddha. His whole 45 years career of teaching people was motivated purely by compassion. Isn't that a powerful thing? Isn't that wonderful? He went out of his way, taught thousands and thousands of people with kindness, with a sense of always trying to be as give them the most suitable teaching for that person's temperament, always using of the profundity of his wisdom, but always, always, always being motivated only by compassion, nothing else, absolutely nothing else. Now, that is a powerful thing here. And when you think of that, the beautiful thing, of course, with that is that when you know what the Buddha taught, you know that you can trust those teachings 100%, because he had no hidden agendas, he had no reason to do these things apart from our benefit here today and the benefits of his listeners 2,500 years ago. So this combination of wisdom and compassion becomes very powerful, because it gives you the ability to give the best possible advice because of the wisdom, and you do it with an absolutely pure heart, because there is no hidden agendas or hidden motives there. This becomes a very powerful and beautiful thing, and I recommend you to reflect on that. Reflect on that when you read the sutras, when you read what the Buddha taught, and know that whatever is in there is only for our benefit and nothing else. So when you read it, if you think that something is difficult to understand, don't get upset, don't get irritated, because it comes from a pure place. It comes from something very beautiful. If you can't understand it, instead just put it to one side and say, okay, don't understand what this means, I'm not going to bother with it now, and then come back to it later on. So those are the two qualities of the Buddha that I wanted to emphasize. There's one last thing I also want to talk about before I end this talk, and that is the reflection that the Buddha is our personal teacher. And sometimes you think that the Buddha, he taught these people 2,500 years ago, he had these large crowds around him listening to him, and that he was actually their teacher. But the reality is that the Buddha knew at that time that the Dhamma, his teaching, was going to last for a very, very long time. The Buddha used to say that I have set in motion the wheel of the Dhamma, this wheel which keeps on rolling, rolling, rolling into the world from place to place, from one time to another time, from one age to another age. It keeps on rolling in the world, and it cannot be stopped by anyone in the world. So this is that wheel of the Dhamma is moving, and he knew that that was happening at this time. So remind yourself that the Buddha, 2,500 years ago, he knew there would be people like us here today, people who want to read, to understand what he taught, and he knew that this was going to happen. So he is, in a very literal sense, he is our teacher, because he knew that we were going to be here. And because of that, when you read his teachings, you find that those teachings are very much not bound up with a particular time or a particular culture. They speak to you very directly, even now, after 2,500 years. And one reason for that, I say, is precisely because he knew that there would be people listening to these teachings even now today. So for that reason, it is surprisingly easy to read the teachings of the Buddha, even though the time and the culture is so different between the two. So think of that. Think of the fact that the Buddha is your personal teacher. Think of the fact that he, in a sense, thought of you 2,500 years ago. When you read the sutras, it's actually the Buddha speaking to you directly, with compassion, with wisdom. And it becomes a beautiful thought, and allow that to lift you up. And when that lifts you up, your mind becomes clear, your heart gets purified from defilements, and you sit down and you meditate, you do metta, loving kindness, or you watch the breath, or whatever you do, and it becomes a beautiful experience, and you find your whole meditation starts to take off. So try these sort of contemplations for yourself. Develop them over time, try to use them, and see if that can help you in your practice on this path. Even if you don't consider yourself maybe a Buddhist, it doesn't matter. The Buddha was obviously a spiritual master in those days, and he would teach both Buddhists and non-Buddhists alike. So, try some of these things and see what happens on this Vesak night today. And afterwards go outside and have a look at the moon, have a look at the night, and get some inspiration in your life, and see if you can get your some extra oomph in your practice, so to speak. Okay, that's my talk this evening here. Okay, are there any questions or comments or anything anybody wants to say? This is your chance. Whatever you like. Anybody out there? Everybody happy? Yeah. Right. Spiritual progression. Yeah. 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 Well, I mean, the problem. I think one of the things about Buddhism is that it doesn't really talk about any spiritual development as if society as a whole or people as a whole develop in a good way. It doesn't really work like that, the Buddhist way. The Buddhist way is more about individuals and how individuals practice. Of course, it has effect on societies as well at large, because if some people are good, other people will be good, and it has like a snowball effect, of course, to some extent. But it's surprising when you look at some of the Buddhist countries in the world, like Sri Lanka or Thailand. Sometimes we find that there are just as much problems in those countries that there are in any other countries. It's not as if they have, look at Thailand, what's happening there now, And of course, even though they are Buddhist there, it doesn't always mean that brings with it a better society. And I think that it's actually spiritual development, therefore, is mostly a personal thing, and it's how you actually develop your spiritual life. Of course, one of the advantages at the time of the Buddha was that you had the Buddha around, and just seeing somebody like that, somebody who's extremely peaceful and kind and compassionate, of course, is going to have a very powerful impact on you. So being there at the time is going to be very powerful. But still, we have the remnants of Buddhism are still here today, even though I think it seems to be declining, and we don't have the same power as we had at the time of the Buddha. It's still here. It's still possible to practice. And I would say, generally speaking, make the Buddhist practice a personal thing. Make it a personal practice, and don't worry too much about, if you do it rightly, it will have an enormous effect on the society around you as well, or some effect at least. But don't worry too much about changing the world or changing society, because essentially, in the end, it can't be done. You can change a little bit, but then it will go back again, back and forth, and you never know whether it's going to be effective or not. So it's dangerous, in my opinion, to have too much attachment, at least, to this idea of changing the world around you. If you're going to be helpful, try to be helpful without having any vested interest in the result of the helping. Help, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and you are usually okay. I think that's the best way to go. Does it make any sense? I'm not sure if I answered your question. Yeah, you happy with that? Yeah, okay, good. Yes? Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Sure, yeah. Yeah, it's yeah. Yeah, yeah, indeed. I think one of the dangers of reading the newspapers is that you always read the bad news, and people's life aren't like that. What you read in the paper is one thing, and your life is something else, and there's a disconnect there between the two. So sometimes they can bring you down if you read too many papers. You think the world might be actually a worse place than it actually is. But of course, if you go to a place like Thailand, you find many wonderful, kind, generous, good-hearted people there, even though you have these problems. It's not, again, Thailand is just like here. There's no difference. You find good people, you find bad people. It's like everywhere else. So it's true, and I think it's good to reflect on that kindness around you, because it gives you a good feeling inside. And I think a lot of people find that there is a lot of goodness in the world. There is a lot of kindness. There are people trying to do the good thing. Look at all the people here today. Look at all the people who are interested in doing something good in the world. And it's wonderful and it's beautiful. And yes, you will see that there are people there who do grow spiritually, who actually do advance. But of course, you also find that there are people who regress, who go backwards. There's all kinds of people. But when you are in a place like this, and if you choose wise friends and good friends in your life, if you're lucky, you will tend to see that people are actually progressing in their lives rather than going backwards. I think that's true, yeah. Okay, anything else? Any other comments? Yes?
Is it our aim to become awakened in our lifetime?
I would say yes, that is the aim. But to actually, the first thing you have to do is really understand what it actually entails to be awakened. You really have to understand the Dhamma fully before you can make that sort of commitment. You can't really make that commitment until you understand what you're talking about. So I would say, from a Buddhist point of view, yes, it is. Should be our aim. But you have to understand the problem first of all. Why do you want to become awakened in the first place? And once you understand that problem, then the motivation will come by itself to move in that direction. So really the way, if you think that is a wise thing to become awakened, to become peaceful and all these things, start reading some of the sutras of the Buddha, start to see what he actually said, start to understand the philosophy behind all of this, why it is so important, why it works, why it is necessary, why there is a problem that needs to be solved. And then the motivation will come. It's not enough just to think, yeah, I want to be awakened. You have to actually build up the motivation inside of you. And that motivation can only come from understanding why you have to do it. And that understanding is something which builds up gradually, because you have to have faith. Imagine when you read the sutras and the Buddha says there is such a thing as rebirth. You think, wait a minute, I don't see any evidence of rebirth. I can't remember my past lives. And yet the Buddha says there is such a thing as rebirth. And the idea of rebirth is not only did he say there is such a thing, but it's central to the whole philosophy of Buddhism. Take it out, you don't have Buddhism anymore. It's extremely important. So because of that, you have to gradually build these things up to be able to accept maybe things which are not as easy for you to accept initially. And if you can't accept them, you may have to go an entirely different way, go your own way, so to speak. So you have to build these things up stage by stage. And then maybe you can get this feeling inside of you that, yes, I want to go towards awakening, because that is the only sensible thing to do with my life. Anything more to say about that? No? Anything else? Anybody? Everybody's happy? Yeah? Well, I think one of the things that I find is that it actually is pretty precarious already, the Dhamma. There isn't that many. If you look around the world and you see how things are going and how things, I'm myself, I'm not very, very optimistic that this is going to last all that long here. And it's a good reflection. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe it will last long. But the very fact that you fear that the Dhamma may die out quite soon gives you a sense of urgency that now is the time to practice. What happens in your next life? Maybe you will be reborn in a place where there's no Dhamma, if you believe in rebirth, that is. Maybe maybe the Dhamma will have died out. Tough luck. That's really going to make it very difficult. So that sort of reflection gives rise to a sense of urgency inside of you that now is the time to do it. So don't think that the Dhamma is going to be around for a long time. It's much better to be a little bit pessimistic. That's what I am. I'm very pessimistic regarding this. That the Dhamma might not be around very long. You never know. This is your chance. You have no idea where you're going to be in your next life. Maybe you have friends who make you become a Muslim instead, or a Christian or whatever, and you can't really do the practice properly anymore. You're in big trouble. don't never think that it's impossible. Never think it's just a matter of how you live your life, basically. Everything is possible. It's just a matter of what you do with your life. So instead of thinking it's impossible, not possible, just keep practicing and see what happens. And as you keep practicing, things change. And if you really are interested, then have a look, see what the Buddha taught. Get deeper insight into understanding what the Buddha taught. Do your very best and then see what happens. Don't have any preconceived ideas whether you can do it or you can't do it, whether you want to be a lay person or you want to be a monastic and all these things. Don't think about that. Just keep practicing. Keep understanding what you're doing. And slowly, gradually, things will change. Your mind will change. The way you understand things will change. And because of that, things will open up which before didn't open up. So don't have a fixed mindset. Just keep an open mind. That's what I recommend. That make sense? Yeah. Yes, sir. I think that there isn't really any such thing as a collective development, because spiritual development is a personal thing here. But what I think you can do, and this is of course an important part of the Buddhist path, is to help other people and to be kind to others. And by being kind to others and by helping others, you are in a sense creating a collective development by doing that. But don't think that, are we going to be a group together, we're going to get together, all of us, we're going to sort of rise out of the problems together. It doesn't really work like that. You're going to have to look after yourself. You're going to have to be independent enough to look after your own practice. And by doing that, you're actually giving other people the best possible opportunity to also prosper in the same practice. I think that is the kind of the Buddhist approach as I understand it. Okay, any final comments?